Welcome to my YouTube channel and podcast where doctrine and life mingle. Thank you guys for dropping in. If you haven't already, please click the subscribe button down below if you're watching on YouTube, and click the bell as well so that you get continued notifications of new content. Also, as always, give us a thumbs up if you liked it, a thumbs down if you didn't. If you didn't like it, leave us a comment, let us know why so we can improve the channel. Anyways, as you guys can see, we are jumping into the third installment within our Federal Vision series. And here I want to recount some of the history of Federal Vision. It's by no means going to be an exhaustive study, and so don't hold me to that kind of a standard. I am not claiming to do an exhaustive study, a completely detailed study of the Federal Vision. So don't hold me to that. I am just merely wanting to recount some of the important aspects of the history of the Federal Vision so that things can be brought into clearer focus in later installments in this series. So I'm going to be talking about the immediate kind of inception of the Federal Vision movement, looking at Auburn Avenue Conference in 2002 and things like that. And I'm going to look at some of the ways in which the Federal Vision would like to ground their argumentation in historical theology. They're not an innovative, they don't want to be innovators, so to speak. So we're going to look at that. So without any further ado, let's jump in. So the history of Federal Vision proper. Here I want to recount the kind of immediate spawning. In fact, that's exactly what I say here. Though the Federal Vision has a valid appeal to historical theological development spanning nearly the last 2 millennia, 2,000 years of the existence of the New Testament church, we should first look at what immediately spawned the Federal Vision movement as we now know it. Dr. Norman Shepherd. This goes back long before the Auburn Avenue Conference in 2002. Shepherd has been writing at least since the 70s and 80s, and so this is nothing that's immediately new. Relatively new, I guess you could say, and even then, I don't think it really is a stretch to say that a lot of this theology is nothing new. So Dr. Norman Shepherd was instrumental in the inception of the Federal Vision. Now, what I don't mean by that is that Dr. Norman Shepherd started the Federal Vision. Okay, he didn't start the Federal Vision. He didn't even probably know the phrase or the term Federal Vision. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm just merely saying that in terms of the development of the Federal Vision theology, Dr. Norman Shepherd was certainly instrumental in that. Though Shepherd did not first know his theological convictions by the moniker of Federal Vision, initially he sowed the seeds for its genesis. Shepherd's definition of faith paved the way for the Federal Vision theology. This is very important because really this seems like a very nuanced thing to us, but this proves to us how nuances, as slight as we may think them to be, have oftentimes broad and far-reaching implications. For Shepherd, as mentioned previously, faith was not only belief and trust in the content of the gospel, but also our obedience. Our obedience, in other words, is an ingredient to faith, and we talked about that a little bit in the definition section in the first episode, in the introduction. Obedience was not the fruit of faith, but was part and parcel with faith, or inherent in the very definition thereof. In other words, to say something like faith is works, or something like that, that's an analytical statement because works inheres in the very definition of faith itself. Okay, so works just is part of faith. Now, so that's kind of the early seeds sown, right? This kind of questioning of what faith is, a definition of faith as it relates to obedience. You can see how this kind of worked its way into a discussion on justification, since faith is the instrument of justification. That's the historical kind of understanding of it. And now, since obedience is a component within faith, is a definitional defining factor within faith itself, and since faith is an instrument of justification, then therefore works is involved in our justification, right? Or obedience is involved in our being justified. But now I want to turn to another parallel movement that was kind of happening at the same time and has indeed, I believe, come into its fullness over the last several years, last decade especially, maybe 2 decades. And that is the new perspectives on Paul, which were kind of arising during Shepard's time and afterwards, kind of at the hands of E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright. If you've been around theological circles, if you've ever gone to seminary, you've interacted with these men and their work. With Sanders came the idea of covenantal maintenance, or the maintaining of our covenantal status for the believer. So for Sanders, God does the electing, but man must maintain his election or his relationship with God by virtue of obedience. And E.P. Sanders, along with Wright, they'll appeal to extra biblical contextual information as kind of defining elements and understanding what the Bible even means by some of these things. N.T. Wright, on the other hand, brought into question the Reformed/Protestant interpretation of the Pauline epistles on a historical basis. Right, so you can kind of see the eclipsing of the doctrine of the sufficiency of the Scriptures with this kind of imperative to know the historical context, whether or not that comes from secondary source material that surrounds the Bible rather than source material that's in the Bible itself. You're seeing a shift from the sufficiency of the Scriptures, the authority of the Scriptures as our ultimate standard, to the historical contextual. In other words, the historical context of the Scriptures defines what the Scriptures mean. In Paul of History, page 87, I believe it was an article, Wright suggests the categories with which we are to understand Paul, and for that matter the whole New Testament, are not the thin, tired, and anachronistic ones of Lutheran polemic. They are the ones given to us by the Paul of history himself. So you can see the crucial place that history occupies in Wright's and even Sanders' understanding of theological method. And here in this quote in particular, you can see N.T. Wright's zeal to kind of get away, from Luther's view. He's not talking about the Lutheran Church there. He's actually talking about Luther and Luther's theology, and then the theology that eventually became kind of codified in the canons of Reformdom. Luther's theology of justification is basically thin, tired, and anachronistic. In other words, Luther is reading a kind of 16th century view of legalities, forensic terminology into the Bible, and that's not legitimate. Okay, so the reason I wanted to show that there's a parallel movement happening is because the new perspective on Paul and Federal Vision have kind of held hands at some times, at least throughout the development of Federal Vision. You've had some Federal Visionists, kind of reaching out and using the scholarship, appealing to the scholarship of N.T. Wright and E.P. Sanders and others, and have kind of borrowed from the new perspective on Paul. The name Federal Vision, actually, is kind of an effort to get away from the systematic thinking that often couches our doctrine of justification, sanctification, glorification, all of these things, kind of our systematic theological categories, trying to get away from those and just using, going back to the language, determining and understanding the meaning of the biblical text through the lens of a vision or story, rather than trying to systematize everything. And the new perspective on Paul does something along the same lines, especially with its emphasis of history over that of, the sufficiency of Scripture and then kind of our metaphysical presuppositions and getting into a full-orbed doctrine of Scripture. It really moves the mark, and it really causes a lot of differences. It's a nuance, some might say. I wouldn't agree with that necessarily, but some consider it a nuance that has far-reaching implications. And so that's why I wanted to talk about the new perspective on Paul. But here, a defining moment is Auburn Avenue. During a 2002 conference at Auburn Avenue Presbyterian Church, various speakers were invited to speak on what they were calling the Federal Vision. And my source material there is the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and its response to the Federal Vision. It's page 56. It's actually, I believe, I'll mention it in the source material down below in the show notes. Steve Wilkins, the then pastor of Auburn Avenue, Doug Wilson and John Barak, Peter Leithart, and others were some of the men who spoke at the conference. The result was a fair amount of controversy within mostly Presbyterian circles originating within the Presbyterian Church of America, PCA. And so there was a wide array of diversity observed among the Federal Vision movement preceding the initial conference. So, and what I mean by this point is that, kind of going back to the fact that we can't throw all these guys into one basket. Even the speakers that were at Auburn Avenue have differences in understanding. Doug Wilson is not going to be on the exact same page as Peter Leithart, and Peter Leithart may not be on the exact same page as John Barak, and John Barak may not be on the same page exactly with Steve Wilkins. Which is why in the following episodes, when we cover the actual position of Federal Vision itself, we're going to be appealing to the joint statement on Federal Vision, which is signed by all of those men. So the things that we're going to look at, we're going to kind of eliminate the doctrinal differences and focus in on the distinctives that they all share in common. Views expressed thereafter include denial of the covenant of works, blurring of the law and gospel distinction, denial of the imputation of the active obedience of Christ in justification, failure to affirm the definitive nature of justification in this life, tendency to merge faith and faithfulness as instrumental in justification, rejection of the visible/invisible church distinction, sacramentalism approaching an ex opere operato position, and mono-covenantalism that not only lends to identify covenant and selection, and election, but sees only one covenant in God and between God and man. And that again is from the same document published by the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I will mention the link in the show notes. So those are kind of the, not all Federal Visionist proponents, not even all the men who were at Auburn Avenue in 2002, would affirm all of these things. But a lot of these things are doctrinal tenets or speculations that came out of the movement. So there are men who actually hold to some of these distinctives, while, that's not necessarily representative of the whole. So we have to be careful of that. There's some very serious error in there, which will be addressed in due course. So, what's the historical underpinnings? Why do these guys think they can do this and then also not be considered really innovators? I mean, they will decry innovation for the sake of innovation, just like the next guy. So, what gives them the right? When we engage Federal Vision, we need to understand that not every form of Federal Vision can be considered a complete innovation. And I think we need to grant that. A lot of guys critiquing Federal Vision will decry it as an innovation for the sake of innovation, but truth be told, it would be very hard to argue, I believe, that every aspect of Federal Vision is innovative. In fact, it might even be hard to argue that any part of Federal Vision theology is totally innovative. I think you can find historical precedent for it. Does that mean it's right? No. Okay, but and likewise, on the other side of the token, just because it's an innovation, does that mean that it's wrong in and of itself? And the answer is no. Although I would say if it's a true innovation, chances are it is grossly false. Federal Visionists often look back to the language of the early church fathers, the Reformers, the Post-Reformed, and even men like John Calvin and John Murray in order to validate the historical development of their views. John Calvin, I believe, actually makes a distinction between like general election and special election. That's something that Federal Visionists often make. So that's not an innovative view. That's not an innovation. That's nothing new. Now, what they mean by it could be an innovation, but the terminology and the categories in and of themselves are not innovations. Now, they appeal to John Murray because Peter Leithart, in an interview with uh, Wilkins, with Steve Wilkins, actually said that, he had problems with Francis Turretin's view of justification, which was the Orthodox view, and cited how John Murray actually observes that, there are these ways in which justification is used in the scriptures that would suggest there is a kind of conflation of it in some sense with our sanctification. In other words, our progress in the faith has something to do with our justification. Justification is not only the forensic aspect, but there's also a developmental kind of an aspect to it as well. Like, we are in the process of being justified. We are in the process of being justified, which I see as a very serious issue if you actually believe that. And we need to talk about why that's a very serious issue later on. But that just to say that, this kind of language is in Murray, and some of it is in Calvin, and as well as Francis Turretin. Like, for example, Peter Leithart will say things like, well, Turretin admits, and I don't doubt this to be the case, I haven't looked myself yet, but I don't doubt this to be the case, that Turretin admits that justification is used equivocally in the scriptures. That is to say that, James isn't using justification, for example, in the same way that Paul's using justification. And the problem with federal visionists is, at least of Leithart's stripe, is that they don't run and recognize that those are equivocal usages of justification. Instead, they want to call it all kind of like one use of justification, and then there's just different aspects of the one single justification, when really James and Paul are using justification equivocally. So there's one sense in which justification can be meant, and there's another sense in which justification can be meant. And the federal visionists would counter by saying, no, that's all of its justification, and they're just looking at it from two different angles. They're just looking at it from two different angles. So while there's this forensic aspect to justification, there's also this progressive kind of sanctifying aspect to justification as well that's very much so tied to our works, our obedience. And he will say that, Francis Turretin is mistaken in saying that the forensic use of justification in the scriptures is the only proper use of the term justification in the scriptures. And he doesn't really offer a whole... He says, well, that's because Turretin has a preconceived notion of what the proper use of justification is. I don't believe that's why. I think Turretin is simply recognizing the fact that the emphatic reality in the scriptures is that we're declared righteous. We have the righteousness of another, which is the stuff that forensic declarative justification is made of. And so there's that sense in which the term justification is used. The other sense of the term in which justification is used is kind of being vindicated in our assurance of our salvation. So, in other words, I'm justified in thinking I'm a Christian, and others are justified in believing that I'm a Christian, and I'm justified before them by my works. So it's this kind of, I'm justifying myself. I'm justifying myself in my profession of faith by my works. And that's a different sense from that of Paul's use of it, which is oftentimes forensic. That is, it's legal. Now, they might cite someone like Herman Hoeksema and his rejection of the covenant of works. That's another example. A lot of federal visionists will reject a covenant of works, and they will cite men like Hoeksema to kind of ground that in history, saying, this is not an innovation. This is something that other people have believed as well, yet you've not decried them as heretics, right? Or they'll cite John Murray in his contention that covenant began post-lapse, right? And that's it. There was no covenant of works. John Murray has that kind of language as well. By the way, this report that I'm talking about is called the Report on Justification, and it's by the OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church. This is page 59. Other Federal Vision adherents are more openly influenced by the New Perspective on Paul, Rich Lusk, Faith That Is Never Alone. Those who are more influenced by the NPP, by the New Perspective on Paul, by men like N.T. Wright and E.P. Sanders, that is pretty innovative. That's pretty innovative. So they're kind of getting away from Reformed Orthodoxy. And I think, these guys have gotten away from Reformed Orthodoxy as well, but at least they're able to appeal to historical development of some of these ideas. Whereas when you look at the New Perspective on Paul, you really just can't do it. And so all this to say that not every tenet of the Federal Vision is an innovation, nor is all of it, without exception, original to the Auburn Avenue progenitors of the more developed version of the Federal Vision. And so I think in order to be fair in our discussion, we need to acknowledge that. What are some other considerations before we kind of go through our concluding remarks? It's important to note that Federal Vision theologians will often contrast their position with Orthodox federal theology, covenant of works, and grace by noting how little the church prior to the 16th and 17th centuries discussed anything resembling the covenant of works. Okay, and here, basically this would be their effort of turning the tables on the Reformed Orthodox and saying, well, you see, you guys were being innovators in the 16th and 17th centuries. Okay, so if you guys can be innovators, it doesn't matter when, really. If you guys can be innovators, then so surely can we afford to have a little bit of innovation in our theology, right? I mean, there wasn't very much talk about a covenant of works prior to the 16th and the 17th centuries in the Garden of Eden, right? But, I mean, that's kind of a word concept fallacy, really, because just because the word wasn't there, the covenant of works doesn't mean the concept isn't present, like Adam's probationary period in the garden, Adam's federal headship in the garden, right? So all of those things were discussed rifely throughout church history preceding the time of the Reformation and the post-Reformation. So, but that's important to consider, that's something that has come up in my research, that's something that they may say, that there really wasn't much consideration or discussion on something like the covenant of works, for example, prior to this time period. They might accuse the Reformed of needless or biased innovation, reading the Bible with a Lutheran bent, not realizing the historical context of Paul. And this objection right here is more proper to the NPP, the New Perspective on Paul, with Sanders or Wright, where they are going to say, well, you're just reading the New Testament with Reformed glasses. And in order to really, truly understand what Paul's saying, you need to grasp his kind of socio-religious historical context. Because if you don't understand that, if you don't understand Second Temple Judaism, then you're not going to understand the New Testament. In other words, if you don't understand, I always find this interesting. If you don't understand Second Temple Judaism, you don't understand the gospel. You don't understand justification. Serious. I mean, that's a very serious claim. And it needs to be dealt with. It needs to be discussed. It needs to be answered. Now, I don't know how many Federal Visionists argue along those lines, but based on the closeness, the kind of intertwining of these two movements at certain periods of time in history, I would say we need to be cautious to watch out for that kind of language. The validity of the objection is highly suspect, obviously, and I wanted to note that in the PowerPoint. Okay, so the conclusion. I want to kind of cover what we have just talked about. Dr. Norman Shepherd played a large part in the formation of the Federal Vision movement, going all the way back to the 1970s. Now, we understand that immediately the Federal Vision movement was really spawned at Auburn Avenue during a conference in 2002. Men like Douglas Wilson, I think Peter Leithart, Barak, and others were there. And so I want to acknowledge that Norman Shepherd was not himself what we would call today a federal visionist, but he did sow some conceptual seeds. For example, looking at faith, the faith of the Christian is just faithfulness, which is basically faith plus obedience, right? The Auburn Avenue Presbyterian Church Conference held in 2002 was a defining moment for what we now know as the federal vision. So that's really important to note as well. This isn't very old. I mean, what is it, 2019 now? So you're looking at 17 years. 17 years it's been about, going on 18. We need to be careful to acknowledge that there is at least some historical support for some tenets of the federal vision, and thus the federal vision should not be totally written off or identified with that of a mere 21st century innovation. To do so would be disingenuous, I think, at worst, and an ugly-looking straw man at best. So I think we just need to grant that. We need to grant that to the federal visionists, that they have some historical precedent. But look, the Roman Catholic Church has a lot of historical precedent. Historical precedent by itself means nothing as far as whether or not something's true. It can inform our understanding of how the church has looked at the scriptures in the past and at various doctrines in the past, but it in and of itself doesn't determine theological truth or doctrinal truth, okay? Unless you elevate tradition to a place of authority alongside the scriptures, in which case we would have to check out of the conversation, because we do not hold to that view of tradition, and we do not hold to that view of the scriptures. So that'd be a serious problem if that were to be admitted. But I don't think it is. See, the federal visionists admit that the scriptures are sufficient, they're authoritative, they're the ultimate standard. And so we have common ground there. We have a starting point there. If federal vision is an innovation, then the Reformed and the particular Baptist theology of the 16th and 17th centuries may also be seen as an innovation. And that's an objection that they have, right? And I think it's a fair one. But I think there needs to be a key difference shown, and I'm going to try to show that key difference later on. Anyways, that is the end of the PowerPoint. That's the end of this segment. And I want to just say to you guys, if this was helpful to you at all, please give me a thumbs up. Let me know. Encourage me in the comment section. I would love to see that. And if it was helpful, please share it if it'd be helpful for someone else, or if you think it would be helpful for someone else on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever. As always, please do not forget to hit the subscribe button and click the bell for continued notifications. God bless you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.